So, building your career, do's and don'ts of the academic job hunt. I imagine you might be wondering what I think qualifies me to be giving you this advice. I've been working with PhDs and postdocs since early 2009, and over that time I have seen literally hundreds of fellowship applications, lectureship applications, postdoc applications, you name it. And one of the things that I've had the chance to do is to study in detail what people are writing, which applications are working, which ones aren't working. And then looking ahead, I've also worked with hundreds of people who've been to real interviews, and I know what was really asked at the interviews and the ultimate outcomes of those. So I've basically had an opportunity to study academic hiring practices in the UK and more broadly looking to some extent at Europe and North America over these years. And what I'm trying to do with this afternoon's lecture is to draw together what feel to me like common principles that come out of all of those careers conversations that I've had. And in particular, what I've tried to address is what I think are the really common conversations, the questions, provocations, concerns that come up in those appointments with academics at an early career stage. Now, we should probably clarify terminology. If I say researchers or early career academics or early career researchers, those are all umbrella terms I'm using to describe you. Some of you in the room, I believe, have finished your PhDs. Some of you are early in your PhDs. I'm going to try to make sure that the advice has broad applicability. As we've already said, there will be time for questions at the end. If along the way I'm saying something and you simply don't understand what I'm talking about, or if you wish to lodge a protest about what I'm saying, then by all means make yourself known and we can address it as we go. But I'm hoping that there'll be plenty of time to pick up your questions at the end. What am I actually intending to cover? I thought we would start actually with a general reminder of what academic career paths in the UK tend to look like. And in particular, what are the challenges that people face when trying to navigate those career paths? And I've got some data as well to describe what actually happens to people once they've completed their PhD. I want to think a bit about what I've called here in a very generic way, becoming a good candidate. In effect, what I'm talking about is things you can be doing now, even if you're not currently on the job market. And then the second half of the lecture is going to be focused more precisely on making good applications. And I've separated preparing to apply from applying. And when we get to it, I'll say a bit more about why I have done that. And then you'll see as a reminder, there's a Q&A at the end. But let's get straight on with this, I called it a reminder of academic career paths. Now I'm going to put up this slide. You will see instantly I have no special talent when it comes to graphical representation of information, for which I can only apologise. This to me feels like a reasonable summary of academic career paths in the UK. So you'll see we're starting with the PhD, and then there's a transition. I'm sorry, I'm not keeping an eye. Most people end up going into some kind of postdoc position before they get a permanent job in academia. So here, what I've called postdoc is thinking specifically about being usually it's called a research assistant or a research associate, working for a principal investigator on a fixed-term contract. The key thing about that is usually then you are appointed by somebody who has designed the project and secured funding for the project themselves. So this is on the whole not an independent position. And both in the last ref and what we're expecting for the next ref, postdocs are not classed as independent. On the other hand, there are postdoctoral fellowships, early career fellowships, mid-career fellowships, postdoctoral fellows, the names vary enormously. And those usually are independent. Those would be positions where you have designed a project and you have applied for money in your own name to carry that out. Very often mentored, but generally independent. So that's what this grey dividing line is, between being a successful researcher working on a project, but being on a project that you yourself have designed. And for most people at that postdoctoral phase, teaching is to some extent optional. Now we can have a different conversation about how desirable it is, but what I mean by that specifically is it's not written into the terms of most postdocs' contracts. And in fact, most fellowships have quite precise guidelines about just how much teaching you are allowed to do. It is, and I've made this a golden leap, it is still just about possible in some subjects to go straight from the PhD to a lectureship. I have worked with a few people who have done it. I even worked once with one person who got a permanent lectureship, and she was appointed just at the end of the second year of her PhD, ready to start at the end of the third year of her PhD. But that's pretty rare, and it's becoming even rarer. What is becoming more standard is a pathway which goes PhD, postdoc, and then some kind of application for an independent position, and then into a lectureship. Now, this doesn't really cover clinical pathways, so if you have a clinical science background, the permeability then between different kinds of roles and different pathways is more complicated and harder to represent. But the key thing that I also wanted to show on this diagram is, at present, your only possibility of securing a permanent position in academia is probably to go down the lecturer, senior lecturer, reader, professor route. Where those job titles exist, like principal scientist or director of research, they are both, on the whole, much more senior. So somebody at an early career stage is not very likely to be successful going for one of those. And they are also very often still on what is called soft money or fixed-term project money. So I have worked, for example, with people who've been principal scientists for 15 years on the same project in the same lab, and they have supervised PhD students, they've successfully applied for funding, but their contract is still fixed term, and at some point that lab winds up and they are out of the job. It's not a permanent position in academia. Those permanent research-only jobs are sufficiently rare that I always think of them as the exceptions that prove the rule. So one of the things I do want to say to you is, if you dislike teaching, your long-term career prospects in academia are probably not in a permanent position. Teaching is the inevitable stage that you're going to have to get to if you want a permanent job. So teaching is essential, and at this point, those positions are independent. You will need to have a vision for your research that involves securing funding, potentially creating a research group, depending on your discipline, but basically having a contribution to your field that you intend to make and a plan for how you're going to make that happen. At every stage of this journey, the skills and attributes that have enabled you to be successful where you presently are not necessarily the same ones you need that will carry you forward to the next step. And that's one of the key messages I want to keep coming back to throughout this session, is how are you going to approach the job market in a way which shows your capacity to take a step up and move forwards. And crucially, in some of the science disciplines where the PhD is not really an independently conceived project, it may very well be a project that was recommended by a supervisor, albeit one that you have carried out, but you were closely supervised and the idea may have come from someone else. For many people, this is the first difficult transition in their academic career path. How are you going to show that you have the skills, the knowledge and the attributes to be independent? By contrast, if you're in, say, an arts and humanities discipline, there are very few postdoc positions working for a PI. For most people, the big cliff edge is this one. You have to go into an early career fellowship because they simply don't have very many of these. So the other thing that's going to keep recurring throughout this lecture is knowing the differences between the different disciplines and knowing what's true for your subject. But I think, broadly speaking, this describes what I think the present reality is. Now, I don't want to have a conversation in this space this afternoon about whether this is what we think higher education should look like and whether this is really how we would like it to be. I'm simply trying to say this is what I think the truth is. So for early career academics, so people in PhDs or early stages of postdoc careers, having a vision for your independent research future and specific funding plans is pretty much what's required to move forward. I want to put that in a bit more context, and I've got some destination data here. This was a longitudinal study that was commissioned by RCUK and carried out by a research organisation, CFE. It was published in 2014, and what they did was they looked at the data we had for PhDs who had graduated, where we knew what they were doing 6 months after graduation, 3.5 years after graduation, and then 7 to 9 years after graduation. And this is one of the only longitudinal pieces of research that I've seen recently that covers all subjects. Now, many of you will have seen that really ghastly Royal Society diagram with the red arrows that show only 0.45% of people will ever make it to professor. That doesn't cover the arts, humanities and social sciences. The numbers look slightly better, actually, when you factor in those other disciplines. What do I think this data is showing us? 7 to 9 years is around the kind of time frame when I think most people would expect you to have transitioned from your PhD to your first lectureship, even in those science subjects where multiple postdocs are the norm. And actually what this shows us is that half of all of those who graduated with a PhD were still working in higher education 7 to 9 years on. Interestingly, that was around 75 to 90% of those people who were working in higher education 6 months after their PhD were still there 7 to 9 years on. So one of the things that suggests is that the transition point out of the PhD to a position in research in higher education, that's an achievable jump. But nearly 10 years later, what this also shows us is that fixed-term contracts were still a feature for many of those. And what particularly it shows us is if you weren't teaching, you were almost certainly on a fixed-term contract. And there are big differences between subjects. The science, technology, engineering, maths, medicine researchers were much more likely to be on a research-only fixed-term contract than their peers in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. And the most depressing statistic of all, I think, is 2/3 of respondents of this survey who were still working in HE 7 to 9 years after completing their PhD had experienced at least one period of unemployment lasting 1 month or more, and 3% of them were unemployed at the time that they were surveyed. What I think this shows us is that the question is perhaps not so much, will you be able to stay in academia, as it is, what compromises are you prepared to make along the way? And in particular, how long are you prepared to stick it out on fixed-term contracts? If people aren't finishing their PhDs until their late 20s, early 30s, perhaps even older, and then you have 10 years of fixed-term contract work ahead of you, is that really what you want for yourself? Is that workable? Can you live with that? In other words, academia at what cost? That's the most frequent conversation I have with people a few years after their PhD. Academia at what cost? And I think this is a space in which we can acknowledge that there is often a really powerful vocational undertone to the way people talk about academia. Who are your mentors at the moment? They're often other academics. They're the people who stayed. They're the people around you. And I think that there's still an unhealthy culture in academia, particularly in the UK, but you do see it elsewhere, of talking about options outside of academia being somehow a route that represents failure, or for those people that weren't able to make it somehow, or weren't able to stick it out. And I think it's really important that we bust that assumption. Actually, the truth is that the most people who leave academia do so for reasons other than not being able to make it. Most people leave because it doesn't fit with their lifestyle or their priorities, or the fixed-term contract working, or they reach a point where they're not prepared to move around between contracts anymore, which is another assumption that often underpins back the academic job market, that movement is somehow good. If you've been in the same place for your master's, your PhD, your first postdoc, and now your fellowship, you are very unlikely to get a lectureship there. At every stage, you make yourself less likely to get a job there because you've stayed. Movement is expected. So I think we need to be talking more about what are acceptable compromises to you personally. And I want to say a bit more about that.